In the autumn of 1878, deep in Wyoming Territory, 12 miles northeast of Fort Laramie, a 42-year-old former shipwright named Thomas Aldrich Brennan began construction on what his neighbors openly called the most foolish waste of timber they'd ever witnessed. Brennan, who had arrived from Portsmouth 2 years prior, seeking land and a fresh start after the shipyards closed, was building a hexagonal cabin. Not just any hexagonal structure, but one with 6 outer walls, spaced precisely 14 inches from 6 inner walls, creating an air gap that ran the entire perimeter of his dwelling. His closest neighbor, Samuel McKittrick, whose traditional square cabin sat 3 miles west, told anyone who would listen that Brennan was building a cabin inside a cabin like some kind of Russian doll, wasting good lodgepole pine that could heat a family through winter. The homesteaders gathering at Clem Morrison's trading post that fall shared stories of Brennan's strange geometry and odd measurements, laughing over whiskey about the Englishman who thought he knew better than men who'd survived 20 Wyoming winters. What none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly imagine as they mocked his 14-inch gap and his obsessive angles, was that in just 4 months, during the catastrophic blizzard of January 1879, Brennan's hexagonal design would maintain an internal temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit, while their traditional square cabins barely held 40 degrees, even as they burned through 3 times as much firewood. The difference wasn't luck or coincidence. It was mathematics, geometry, and an observation about ship hulls that Brennan had made 15 years earlier in a Portsmouth dry dock. Thomas Brennan had spent 23 years building ships before the economic collapse of 1876 forced the shipyards to close. He wasn't a formally educated engineer, but he understood wood, structure, and most importantly, he understood heat loss. In Portsmouth, he'd noticed how the curved hulls of ships shed ice differently than flat surfaces, how corners and right angles became thermal weak points where cold penetrated fastest. When he arrived in Wyoming and spent his first winter in a borrowed square cabin, he nearly froze despite burning through 2 cords of wood per month. The cabin's 4 corners were so cold that ice formed on the inside walls, and the single fireplace could barely heat the rectangular space efficiently. Heat rose to the peaked roof and stagnated there while the corners remained frigid. That winter, Brennan measured the temperature differential with a mercury thermometer he'd brought from England. The center of the cabin near the fireplace reached 62 degrees, but the corners never exceeded 38 degrees, even with the fire roaring. He calculated he was wasting nearly 40% of his heat to poor geometry and inadequate insulation. By spring, he'd sketched his hexagonal design on the back of a feed sack, showing how 6 walls instead of 4 would eliminate the extreme corner angles, how the air gap would create a thermal barrier, and how the geometry would distribute heat more evenly from a central fireplace. When he showed his drawings to Samuel McKittrick and the other homesteaders, they looked at him like he'd proposed building a palace. "A wall around a wall," McKittrick said, shaking his head. "You'll use twice the timber to stay just as cold." But Brennan had done his calculations. A traditional 16 by 16 foot square cabin required 64 feet of perimeter wall. His hexagonal design, with each outer wall measuring 9 feet 6 inches, required only 57 feet of outer perimeter, actually using less timber for the exterior. The inner hexagon, with each wall measuring 8 feet, required only 48 feet of interior perimeter. The 14-inch gap between them was the critical element. Brennan had observed in the shipyards how dead airspace insulated better than solid wood, how the trapped, unmoving air acted as a barrier. He explained this to his neighbours, tried to show them how the double-wall system would work like wearing two coats, with air between them instead of one thick coat. They didn't understand. John Hargrove, who ran a small cattle operation 11 miles south, told him directly, "Tom, we've been building square cabins for 100 years because they work. Your fancy ideas might have made sense on them ships, but this is Wyoming, not the ocean." Brennan thanked him for the advice and kept building. The construction began in September 1878. Brennan cut 114 lodgepole pines from the forest 4 miles north of his claim, each tree selected for straightness and diameter between 8 and 12 inches. He stripped them, cut them to precise lengths, and hauled them to his building site using a team of borrowed oxen. The foundation was crucial. He dug 6 foundation trenches in a perfect hexagonal pattern, each trench 14 inches deep and filled with river stones for drainage. Using rope and stakes, he marked the exact placement of each wall section, ensuring the angles were as close to 120 degrees as he could achieve with the tools available. The outer walls went up first, each wall 9 feet 6 inches long and 7 feet high at the lowest point, rising to a central peak of 12 feet. He notched the logs with a precision that came from decades of shipbuilding, making sure each joint was tight and stable. The roof framing followed the hexagonal pattern, 6 rafters meeting at a central point with a stone chimney rising through the exact center. This central placement was critical to his design. In a square cabin, a corner fireplace was common, but it heated unevenly. Brennan's central fireplace would be equidistant from all 6 walls, radiating heat in all directions equally. With the outer structure complete by early October, the real innovation began. Brennan constructed the inner hexagon, each wall exactly 14 inches inside the corresponding outer wall. He used smaller diameter logs for the inner walls, 6 to 8 inches, since they bore no structural load. The inner walls were purely functional, creating the living space and maintaining the air gap. He sealed the inner walls with a mixture of clay, dried grass, and pine pitch, making them as airtight as possible. The outer walls he left with gaps between the logs, deliberately allowing some air circulation in the gap space. This seemed counterintuitive to anyone watching, and it became another source of mockery. "He's sealing the inside and leaving gaps in the outside," McKittrick told people. "The man's building his cabin backwards." But Brennan knew what he was doing. The air gap needed some circulation to prevent moisture buildup, but the inner wall needed to be sealed to prevent heat loss from the living space. The circulation in the gap would be minimal, just enough to keep the trapped air dry, which would improve its insulating properties. Moisture was the enemy of insulation, something he'd learned watching ice form on the inside of cabin walls his first winter. The construction process took 4 months of nearly continuous work. Brennan worked alone for most of it, occasionally receiving reluctant help from a few neighbors who felt obligated to assist, even though they thought the project was absurd. By early January 1879, the cabin was complete. The total timber count was 114 trees, less than the 130 trees typically required for a comparable square cabin of similar interior square footage. The interior space was approximately 249 square feet, comparable to a 16 by 16 square cabin's 256 square feet. The difference in geometry meant Brennan actually had fewer true corners where heat could stagnate. The 6 obtuse angles of the hexagon were far less problematic than the 4 right angles of a square structure. He'd calculated that each 120-degree angle would shed heat more efficiently than a 90-degree corner, reducing the cold spots that plagued traditional cabins. The central fireplace was built from river stones he'd collected over 3 months, with a flue designed to draw efficiently while radiating maximum heat into the living space. He'd even incorporated a small alcove in one wall section for a secondary heat source, a small metal stove he'd purchased at the trading post for emergency heating. The first test came during a moderate cold snap in mid-January, when temperatures dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. Brennan burned a modest fire in his central fireplace, using approximately 12 pounds of split pine. By his measurements, the interior temperature stabilized at 62 degrees. He walked the 3 miles to McKittrick's square cabin to compare notes. McKittrick, burning a roaring fire that consumed nearly 20 pounds of wood, was maintaining an interior temperature of 54 degrees, and that was in the center of his cabin, near the fireplace. The corners of McKittrick's cabin were visibly frosted over on the inside. Brennan tried to explain the difference, how his air gap was acting as insulation, how the hexagonal geometry distributed heat more evenly, how his central fireplace placement was more efficient than McKittrick's corner fireplace. McKittrick, sitting close to his fire to stay warm, just shook his head. "You got lucky with a warm spot on your land, Tom. That's all it is. Wait till a real winter storm hits. Then we'll see how your fancy boat-building ideas hold up." Brennan didn't argue. He knew what was coming. The old-timers at the trading post had been predicting it for weeks. The signs were there for anyone who knew how to read them. The elk had moved down from the high country 3 weeks earlier than normal. The beavers had built their lodges thicker than usual. The sky had that peculiar pale quality that preceded major storms. Brennan had lived through enough English winters to recognize the warnings. Something significant was building. Before we continue with what happened when that storm arrived, it's worth taking a moment to recognize why stories like Thomas Brennan's matter today. These weren't just clever tricks or lucky guesses. These were solutions born from observation, persistence, and the kind of practical engineering that kept families alive on the frontier. When you subscribe to this channel and engage with these stories by leaving a like or sharing your thoughts in the comments, you're helping preserve this knowledge. You're keeping alive the memory of people who solved impossible problems with limited resources and unlimited ingenuity. There are hundreds of stories like Brennan's, techniques and innovations that saved lives, but were never written down in engineering textbooks because the people who invented them were too busy surviving to document their work. Every subscription helps ensure these frontier innovations aren't lost to history. So if you value this kind of practical wisdom, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and let me know in the comments if you've heard similar stories from your own family history. Now, let's talk about the science that made Brennan's cabin work, because understanding the why is just as important as knowing the what. The principle behind Brennan's double-wall hexagonal design involves 3 fundamental concepts of thermodynamics that he understood intuitively, even if he didn't know the scientific terminology. First, conduction, the transfer of heat through solid materials. Wood conducts heat, but it conducts it slowly. A single wall of 6-inch logs loses heat through conduction, as the warmth from the interior slowly transfers through the wood to the cold exterior. Brennan's inner wall conducted heat outward, but instead of meeting cold air directly, it met the static air in the 14-inch gap. That air, trapped and relatively still, conducted heat far more slowly than the wood itself. It acted as a thermal brake, dramatically slowing the conduction process. Second, convection, the movement of heat through air currents. In a traditional cabin, warm air rises to the ceiling while cold air sinks to the floor, creating constant circulation that pulls heat away from living space and concentrates it uselessly near the roof peak. Brennan's central fireplace and hexagonal geometry minimized these convection patterns. The heat radiated outward in 6 equal directions, and the shape of the space meant there were fewer dead zones where cold air could pool. The geometry naturally encouraged more even heat distribution. Third, radiation, the transfer of heat through electromagnetic waves. Every surface emits infrared radiation proportional to its temperature. Brennan's inner walls radiated heat into the living space, while the outer walls radiated heat into the surrounding landscape. But here's the critical part. The air gap absorbed and re-radiated that heat multiple times before it escaped to the exterior. Each wall surface in the gap acted like a mirror for infrared radiation, bouncing heat back and forth, slowing its escape. The result was a thermal buffer zone that traditional single-wall cabins simply didn't have. To put it in simpler terms that Brennan himself might have used, imagine wearing one thick wool coat versus wearing 2 thinner coats with air trapped between them. The single thick coat keeps you warmer than no coat, but the 2 coats with the air gap keep you dramatically warmer than the single thick coat, even if the total amount of wool is the same or even less. The trapped air is doing most of the insulating work. Brennan's cabin worked on this exact principle, just on a larger scale. The 14-inch gap wasn't arbitrary. In his shipbuilding experience, he'd noticed that gaps smaller than 10 inches didn't create enough of a thermal buffer, while gaps larger than 18 inches actually allowed too much air circulation within the gap, reducing effectiveness. 14 inches was the sweet spot he'd calculated based on the materials available and the wall heights he could practically build. It was wide enough to create a significant thermal barrier, but narrow enough to keep the trapped air relatively static. The hexagonal shape contributed to efficiency in another way Brennan had calculated. Heat loss in a structure is proportional to surface area. For a given interior volume, a hexagon has less surface area than a square, meaning less total area through which heat can escape. Not dramatically less, but every advantage mattered when winter temperatures could drop to 30 below zero. Additionally, the geometry of the hexagon meant that the distance from the central fireplace to any wall was nearly equal, roughly 7 feet. In a 16 by 16 square cabin with a corner fireplace, the distance from fireplace to far corner was over 22 feet. That difference in distance meant massive differences in heat distribution. Brennan's design naturally created more even temperatures throughout the living space. But understanding why it worked and proving it worked in the real world were 2 different things. That proof came in late January 1879, when the worst blizzard in recorded Wyoming Territory history descended on the Fort Laramie region. The storm had been building for 3 days, visible as a dark mass on the northwestern horizon. Old-timers at Morrison's trading post, men who'd been in the territory since the 1850s, said they'd never seen clouds stack like that. The temperature had been dropping steadily, from 32 degrees on January 24th to 18 degrees on the 26th to 6 degrees on the 28th. The wind had picked up, coming in gusts that rattled cabin walls and sent livestock seeking shelter. Morrison himself, a grizzled veteran of 34 Wyoming winters, told his customers to stock up on firewood and supplies. "This one's going to be bad," he said. "Real bad. I've seen this pattern twice before, once in 49 and once in 64. Both times we lost people." The homesteaders took him seriously. Samuel McKittrick cut and split 4 cords of wood in 2 days, more than he'd normally burn in a month. John Hargrove brought his cattle as close to his cabin as possible, trying to provide them some protection from what was coming. Brennan in his hexagonal cabin had been preparing for weeks. He had 2 cords of split pine stacked inside his cabin, and another cord stacked under a covered lean-to outside. He'd sealed every gap in his inner walls with fresh pine pitch. He'd checked his chimney for obstructions and tested his ventilation. He was as ready as any man could be. The blizzard hit Fort Laramie on January 29, 1879, at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The temperature plummeted from 6 degrees to -4 degrees in less than an hour. The wind, which had been gusting at 20 miles per hour, increased to sustained speeds of 45 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 60. Snow began falling so heavily that visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. By nightfall, the temperature had fallen to -18 degrees. By midnight, it had reached -26 degrees. The wind continued at full force, creating a wind chill that territory survivors would later estimate at -60 degrees or colder. The storm lasted for 73 hours without pause. Inside traditional square cabins across the territory, families huddled near fireplaces, burning wood at an unsustainable rate just to keep interior temperatures above freezing. Samuel McKittrick's family, wrapped in every blanket they owned, sat within 5 feet of their roaring fireplace. McKittrick was burning 40 pounds of wood every 3 hours, a rate that would exhaust his 4-cord supply in less than a week if the storm continued. Despite this massive consumption, the temperature in the center of his cabin hovered at 41 degrees. The corners of his cabin were below freezing, with ice forming on the interior walls an inch thick. His children cried from the cold. His wife stuffed rags into gaps between logs. But the wind found every crack, every imperfection. The single-wall construction simply couldn't hold heat against the assault of -26 degrees and 60-mile-per-hour winds. John Hargrove's situation was even worse. His cabin, older and less well-maintained, was barely managing 38 degrees at the center, despite burning 50 pounds of wood every 3 hours. He knew he couldn't sustain that rate. By the second day of the storm, he was rationing wood, letting the temperature drop to dangerous levels to make his supply last. Inside his hexagonal cabin, Thomas Brennan sat comfortably in his shirt sleeves, reading by lamplight. The central fireplace burned modestly, consuming approximately 14 pounds of wood every 3 hours, 1/3 of what McKittrick was burning. The interior temperature measured by his mercury thermometer held steady at 68 degrees, not near the fireplace. Everywhere, the hexagonal geometry and the insulating air gap created such even heat distribution that there were no cold zones. Brennan could walk to any of the 6 walls and find the temperature within 2 degrees of 68. The outer walls of his cabin were indeed cold, coated with ice on the exterior and frost on the interior side of the gap, but the inner walls remained warm to the touch. The 14-inch air gap was doing exactly what he designed it to do, creating a thermal buffer that the storm couldn't penetrate. He slept in his bed, not huddled by the fire. He cooked meals on his stove, not rationed cold food. He maintained his normal routine, largely unaffected by the catastrophic conditions outside. The only concession he made to the storm was burning slightly more wood than he would in moderate cold, increasing his consumption from 10 pounds per 3 hours to 14 pounds per 3 hours. That was it. A 40% increase in wood consumption to maintain comfortable living conditions during the worst blizzard in Wyoming history. On the evening of the second day, January 31st, with the storm still raging at full intensity, Brennan heard desperate pounding on his door. He opened it to find Samuel McKittrick, ice-crusted and half-frozen, having walked 3 miles through the blizzard. McKittrick stumbled inside and immediately Visibly, his body language changed. The warmth hit him like a physical force. His eyes widened. He looked at Brennan, then at the modest fire burning in the central fireplace, then at the thermometer on the wall reading 68 degrees. How, was all he could say. Brennan sat him down, gave him hot coffee, and waited for McKittrick to thaw before explaining. McKittrick's situation was desperate. He'd run through 3.5 of his 4 cords of wood. At his current burn rate, he had less than 24 hours of fuel remaining, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. His family was suffering. His youngest daughter had frostbite on her toes, despite being inside the cabin. He'd come to Brennan not to apologize, not to admit he'd been wrong, but to ask for help, for wood, for anything. Brennan didn't gloat. He didn't lecture. He simply asked McKittrick to look around. "Feel the temperature anywhere in this cabin," Brennan said. "Walk to any wall. Check behind the bed. Tell me if you find a cold spot." McKittrick did. He walked the perimeter of the hexagonal space, touched the inner walls, checked the corners where walls met. Everywhere, warmth, even heat. No cold zones, no ice on the interior walls, no frost, no wind penetrating through cracks. The cabin was sealed, insulated, and efficiently heated. McKittrick stood there, a man who'd spent 20 winters in Wyoming, a man who'd mocked this design for 4 months, and he said the words that Brennan had been waiting to hear since September. "You were right. I was wrong. This is better." The numbers proved it beyond any argument. Brennan's cabin, 68 degrees, burning 14 pounds of wood per 3 hours. McKittrick's cabin, 41 degrees, burning 40 pounds of wood per 3 hours. The difference wasn't marginal. It was the difference between comfort and suffering, between sustainability and running out of fuel, between a successful winter and a potentially fatal one. Brennan didn't just give McKittrick firewood, though he did provide enough split pine to help McKittrick's family through the remainder of the storm. He gave him something more valuable: information. He explained the double wall principle, the air gap insulation, the hexagonal geometry, the central fireplace placement. He showed McKittrick his original sketches on the feed sack, now pinned to his wall, with measurements and calculations marked in pencil. He explained the science as simply as he could, using the layered coat analogy, explaining heat conduction and trapped air. McKittrick listened, really listened this time, not with skepticism, but with the desperate attention of a man who'd nearly lost his family to cold. When the storm finally broke on February 1st, revealing a landscape buried under 6 feet of snow, with drifts reaching 12 feet, the word spread quickly. McKittrick, to his credit, didn't try to hide his error. He told everyone who would listen about Brennan's cabin, about the temperature difference, about burning 1/3 the wood to stay twice as warm. He described walking into that hexagonal space and feeling the even warmth, the complete absence of cold spots, the efficiency of the design. The story spread through the Fort Laramie region like wildfire, carried by the same men who'd mocked Brennan's cabin inside a cabin just months earlier. The numbers were too dramatic to ignore. 27-degree temperature difference, 68 versus 41, 1/3 the wood consumption, no cold zones, no ice on interior walls. These weren't subjective impressions. These were measurable facts. By the spring of 1879, 7 homesteaders within 20 miles of Fort Laramie had begun construction on hexagonal cabins following Brennan's design. McKittrick was the first, starting in March as soon as the ground thawed enough to dig foundation trenches. He followed Brennan's specifications exactly: 6 outer walls, 9 feet 6 inches each, 6 inner walls, 8 feet each, 14-inch air gap, central fireplace. By the following winter, McKittrick's new hexagonal cabin performed exactly as Brennan's had, maintaining comfortable temperatures with a fraction of the wood consumption his old square cabin had required. John Hargrove built one the following summer. So did Clem Morrison, who abandoned his square trading post structure and built a larger hexagonal design that could accommodate his merchandise and his living quarters. Within 3 years, 16 hexagonal cabins dotted the landscape around Fort Laramie. The design became known locally as the Brennan Hexagon, though Brennan himself never sought credit or payment for sharing his innovation. When asked why he'd given away his design instead of charging for the information, he reportedly said, "A man who hoards knowledge that could save lives isn't a man worth knowing. Besides, I've got enough wood to last me through winter now. That's all I need." The efficiency gains were consistent across all implementations. Homesteaders reported temperature improvements ranging from 23 to 29 degrees compared to equivalent square cabins under identical exterior conditions. Firewood consumption dropped by an average of 62%. The reduction in wood gathering alone saved each family approximately 200 hours of labor per winter, time that could be spent on other survival tasks or simply on rest. The hexagonal design also proved more durable than expected. The geometry distributed wind loads more evenly than square structures, reducing stress on joints and connections. Several Brennan hexagon cabins built in 1879 and 1880 survived well into the 20th century, long after comparable square cabins had collapsed or been torn down. Brennan's original cabin remained standing and occupied until 1927, 48 years after its construction. 4 different families lived in it over that period, each confirming the same exceptional heat retention and efficiency. When it was finally dismantled to make way for a larger frame house, the timber was examined and found to be in remarkably good condition, the double-wall design having protected the wood from the worst of Wyoming's temperature extremes. The logs from Brennan's cabin were salvaged and used to build a barn that stood until the 1960s. The story of the Brennan Hexagon didn't spread far beyond Wyoming territory, primarily because it emerged during a period when standardized construction methods were becoming dominant, and most building was shifting toward rectangular frame houses rather than log structures. By the 1880s, the railroad had made milled lumber widely available, reducing the need for log construction innovations. The hexagonal design, brilliant as it was, represented the peak of log cabin engineering just as log cabins themselves were becoming obsolete. But within its specific context, within the community that witnessed its development and validation, the Brennan Hexagon became legendary. It represented something profound about the frontier experience. The willingness to question conventional wisdom, the courage to try unconventional solutions, and the vindication that comes when persistence and observation triumph over tradition and skepticism. Thomas Brennan died in 1903 at age 67, respected throughout the Fort Laramie region as the man who'd revolutionized winter survival. His gravestone, in a small cemetery 12 miles northeast of Fort Laramie, bears a simple inscription: "He built well and shared freely." What Thomas Brennan accomplished with his hexagonal cabin design represents more than just an engineering innovation, though the engineering itself was remarkable. It represents a fundamental pattern in how human progress actually happens. Brennan wasn't a university-educated engineer. He was a shipwright who paid attention, who observed how heat moved through structures, who questioned why things were done a certain way when observations suggested better alternatives might exist. He faced ridicule from his community, men who'd spent decades in Wyoming and believed they knew everything about surviving frontier winters. He could have abandoned his idea, built a traditional square cabin, and blended in. Instead, he persisted, built his hexagonal design, and let the results speak for themselves. The numbers didn't lie. 68 degrees versus 41 degrees. 1/3 the firewood consumption. No cold zones. When the crisis came, when the worst blizzard in Wyoming history tested every structure and every design, Brennan's innovation proved itself definitively. The skeptics didn't just change their minds. They actively adopted his design and spread the knowledge to others. This pattern, ridicule followed by validation followed by adoption, has repeated throughout history whenever genuine innovation challenges established practice. The frontier bred this kind of practical problem-solving because it had to. There were no authorities to consult, no building codes to reference, no engineering firms to hire. There was only observation, experimentation, and the ruthless testing ground of survival. If your design worked, you lived comfortably. If it didn't, you suffered or died. This created an environment where good ideas could emerge from anyone, regardless of formal credentials, and where those ideas were judged solely on measurable results. Brennan's hexagonal cabin wasn't adopted because he was an authority figure or because he had impressive credentials. It was adopted because it demonstrably worked better than the alternative, proven under the most extreme conditions imaginable. That kind of empirical validation is powerful, perhaps the most powerful force in human innovation. It's also increasingly rare in our modern world, where credentials often matter more than results, where established methods persist even when observation suggests they're suboptimal, where questioning conventional wisdom can invite ridicule that isn't followed by fair testing. The frontier forced people to care about what actually worked, not what was supposed to work or what had always been done. That focus on measurable real-world results is something worth preserving and celebrating. The story of Thomas Brennan and his hexagonal cabin also reminds us that knowledge can be lost. The techniques that saved lives on the frontier weren't always documented in engineering textbooks or passed down through formal education systems. They were practical innovations developed by working people, solving immediate problems. And when those specific problems became obsolete, the solutions often disappeared with them. How many other Brennan hexagons existed, innovations that worked brilliantly in their context, but were never recorded, never studied, never preserved? We'll never know, and that's a loss. Every subscription to channels like this one, every like, every comment sharing family stories or local history helps fight against that loss. You're creating a community that values practical wisdom, that respects the ingenuity of people who built America with their hands and their minds, that understands the difference between theoretical knowledge and proven solutions. These frontier innovations weren't just clever tricks. They were survival tools developed through observation, refined through experimentation, and validated through the harshest testing conditions nature could provide. They represent a kind of knowledge that our ancestors earned through hard experience, and they deserve to be remembered, studied, and respected. So, if this story resonated with you, if you value this kind of historical engineering knowledge, take a moment to subscribe, leave a like to help others discover these stories, and share in the comments whether you've heard similar tales of frontier innovation in your own family history or local area. There are hundreds of stories like Brennan's waiting to be told, techniques and innovations that saved lives but were never famous, never celebrated, just quietly effective. Your engagement helps keep that knowledge alive. The final measurement tells the story more clearly than any words. 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That was the temperature difference between Brennan's hexagonal cabin and McKittrick's traditional square cabin during the blizzard of 1879, both measured at center interior points under identical exterior conditions. 28 degrees wasn't just a number. It was the difference between children crying from cold and children sleeping comfortably. It was the difference between burning through a month's firewood in 6 days and sustaining heat for weeks. It was the difference between desperation and security, between questioning your survival and knowing you'd be fine. Thomas Brennan created that 28-degree difference through observation, calculation, and the courage to build something unconventional despite community mockery. He proved that geometry matters, that air gaps work, that central heating is more efficient than corner heating, that conventional wisdom isn't always wise. The frontier tested his design with -26-degree temperatures and 60-mile-per-hour winds, and his design passed that test so decisively that skeptics became evangelists, spreading his innovation throughout the region. Those hexagonal cabins, built by men who'd initially mocked the idea, stood for decades, keeping families warm through Wyoming winters, validating over and over again what Brennan had known from the beginning. Observation and engineering will always triumph over tradition and assumption, as long as you're willing to let the results speak for themselves. 28 degrees. That's the measure of what one man's ingenuity could accomplish on the American frontier when observation met persistence, and neither would back down.